Great. Hello, everybody. I am Mary Bernstein. I'm Associate Dean of the Graduate School and Professor of Sociology, and I am super excited to be here to introduce Dr. Sarah McMahon, who is giving today's InCHIP lecture. The title of Dr. McMahon's talk is Ecological and Social Justice-Based Bystander Intervention to Prevent Interpersonal Violence. Sarah McMahon is a professor at the Rutgers University School of Social Work and director for the school's Center for Research on Ending Violence. She also serves as special advisor on sexual misconduct prevention and response in the Office of the President. Her research focuses on using ecological, social justice-based frameworks to examine the prevention of interpersonal violence, as well as mechanisms for engaging individuals, communities, and institutions in social change. Dr. McMahon's work also explores the way in which participatory collaborative processes can enhance the translation of research to practice in community settings, including workplaces. Dr. McMahon has conducted several studies on the role of bystander intervention as a tool for preventing and responding to interpersonal violence across various settings, including academia and workplaces. Before I turn it over to Dr. McMahon, I just want to note that participants will be muted until the end of the talk. The talk should be about 45 minutes, and then we will have time for Q&A from about 1:15 to 1:30. You are more than welcome to put questions in the chat as we go, but we will hold the questions until the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. McMahon.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. It is wonderful to be here today. It's such a privilege. And just before we got on, we were all commiserating about the weather and how it can make some of us sleepy. So I hope that this will not put you to sleep. Hope that you have whatever caffeinated beverages and whatever you need during this presentation. But really, it's such a lovely invitation. And I always appreciate the chance to talk about these topics and to learn from colleagues. I see some familiar names here as well, and so eager to learn from all of you throughout this presentation as well. So the title is here, and I sort of wanted to move into the reason why I was invited now is because it is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, as many of you likely know. April's such a busy time, and so again, just really appreciate you all making the time to be here today. I have lots of thoughts about awareness months in general. I think overall it's really beneficial, and it allows us to really amplify different issues and I think engage people who maybe weren't tuned into the topic, or it gives us an opportunity to remind ourselves of how important these topics are. And so I welcome any chance to talk about these issues because to me, even though I've been doing this work for over 20 years, sexual violence is still an urgent issue and it needs a lot of attention. If anyone's been tuned into the news, it's there almost every day in different forms, and clearly we still have a lot of work to take. I feel like it's really urgent still, and one that is also largely preventable, and one where we also all have actions that we can take. So I've shared some pictures here of our staff at the Center for Research on Ending Violence. We are celebrating our 20th anniversary next year, and that's something that we're really excited about. And so we are participating in Sexual Assault Awareness Month, as we do for many other issues. And I really do value, any opportunity to elevate the topic. And at the same time, why I have this note here is I'm sure many of you would agree that, we need more than a day or a month to really make some change that is meaningful. We need this to be on people's minds consistently. So I'm grateful to be here today with you to invite you to help, not only as a part of recognizing Sexual Assault Awareness Month, but inviting you to continue the work you're doing and or to join us as part of a larger movement trying to prevent this from happening to other people. So just briefly, this is what I'm hoping to talk about today, but I hope, of course, there will be some room for conversation. I come at this from wearing a few different hats. So I am from the School of Social Work. I'm a social worker at heart. I started as a practitioner many years ago, and I worked directly with survivors who had been impacted by different types of violence. I've been on call 24/7 and learned a lot about prevention and people's experiences. And after being a practitioner for around 9 years, I started wanting to know more about like why some of this was happening, which led me into some more of the research angles. And my practitioner friends said that I went over to the dark side of academia, but I really try to make sure that the work here and at the center is always about that nexus of research and practice. So I come to my work from that vantage point. I also just like to mention, of course, that we know issues of sexual violence are widespread, and I'm sure it's impacted some of us here today, whether it's individuals directly or people that we care about or something that we think about. And so, a tenet of social work, good social work practice is to make sure we're engaging in self care. So, encouraging everyone to do whatever is needed throughout the presentation, to take breaks, to step away or step off, and do whatever, of course, is needed. I know that UConn has resources as well, and encourage you to take advantage of those. So this is what I'm hoping to talk about today is really the idea of prevention, and specifically bystander intervention. Um, that is where my research has been for the last few decades, and I'm a big believer in the benefits of bystander intervention. But I've also really started to take a more critical look at it, along with other colleagues, to figure out a more nuanced approach to it. Like, is it really working for everybody? Is it giving us the outcomes we want? What are other pieces of prevention that might need to be part of the scaffolding or accompany it? And especially, how are we thinking about issues of power and differential sort of risk and vulnerability for people who we're asking to step into really difficult situations? So that's what I'm hoping to talk about today a little bit is some and share some results from some of the more recent studies we've been doing to look at this from a little bit of a more nuanced angle. And then also, of course, as a social worker, wanting to be strengths-based and focus on, solutions as well. So what are some of the things that we can do to really bolster or question or extend our work on bystander intervention to be more effective? So please, I hope you'll continue to put comments and questions in the chat, and that we'll have a chance to talk through these as well as the lecture portion concludes. So, some of you likely know this already and can think back. I know I can, back to the 1980s and even into the 1990s, just thinking about like sexual violence prevention. And usually at that point, right, like this was sort of campus sexual violence was going on for a long time, but it was really just sort of named for what it was, with research starting on it in the late 70s, early 80s. And when people realized how widespread it was, there was this feeling like, of course, we have to do something. But the message was really directed mostly at women. And it placed the responsibility for preventing victimization on them based on their behaviors. Like, you should not walk alone at night. You should carry mace. You should not dress a certain way. So basically, the message there was women, don't do all these things, don't be a victim. Now, we have moved from that, although every once in a while I still see things that, you know, suggest that. Someone sent me an email message recently and was saying they wanted to send it to all of the women in their life. And it was talking about like, don't wear a ponytail when you're in a like a mall parking lot because someone can grab it. And I appreciate the care we need to have for sort of universal precautions that we want to take, and I think we're learning that over the years. So eventually, this work I think really did start to evolve and realize we need to bring men and boys into the picture. And this was largely through educational programs. But the messaging, really, whether directly or indirectly, was that men were behaving badly, and that, they really shouldn't engage in sexual assault. And so there was evidence and from evaluations of programs that that did not really welcome men and boys into this work, right? It made them feel defensive, automatically put up barriers to engaging them in meaningful ways. Most men and boys do not engage in this behavior. And so it wasn't tapping into sort of any of that. In fact, it was really making people feel disconnected from the work. And this is also, right, there were only two genders that were recognized. Like no other gender identities were really ever included in our early work in looking at sexual violence. So in the early, 2000s, there was this shift on really how do we address prevention based on some of what I was just mentioning. And this was largely due to the effects of my wonderful colleague, Vicki Banyard. Some of you may be familiar with her work. She actually works right down the hall and poked her head in here right before the presentation, and has been a wonderful mentor for me. And she did some work that really helped reframe what prevention could look like as a community level effort, and one where everyone could be involved in ways that were not only reactive, but also proactive. So she really took the work of social psychologists Latine and Darley, who those names may be familiar to some of you from their work in the late 60s, early 70s, and they looked at the role of bystanders in emergency situations. And Vicki and her team and her colleagues extended this approach to really looking at sexual violence, specifically campus sexual violence. And the premise being that, there are opportunities to intervene before, during, or after sexual violence occurs. And that this is something when we belong to a community and we have a vision of what that community could look like, that it's our responsibility to have a role to play in that and creating that. So she also talked about, proactive behaviors. So even if it wasn't reacting to a particular incident, what are the things we can be doing to really promote good helping behaviors, social norms that support this kind of effort? And again, contributing to the type of community that we want to see. So this really started to shift things in the early 2000s, to thinking about, oh, there's a way we can include everyone in ways that maybe would address some of the defensiveness that previous efforts had promoted. So bystander intervention then sort of took off. Many of you are probably familiar with bystander intervention at this point. It's been really well accepted and it's been adopted at a very fast rate. Generally, practitioners have found it much more engaging and applicable to, large audiences of mixed genders. Entities such as the White House Task Force under the Biden administration recommended bystander intervention, which elevated it even further. And it's required actually for institutions, for campuses that receive any federal funding under the Federal Campus Save Act. However, as bystander intervention approaches grew, it also became evident that it requires specific skill building, right? And it's not actually always easy to intervene. So this is a sign that some of you may have seen versions of this, either when you're down visiting New York City or elsewhere, right? Like the message sometimes is interpreted as overly simplified, in my view, that just like if you see something going on, you have to say something. But again, we know it's actually not that easy. And so I'm sharing a photo here with you of a hospital setting near me. And this was just an interesting like reflection point for me. This was a couple years ago. I was visiting somebody in the emergency room. And when I came out of those doors under where it says emergency and started walking down towards the parking lot, there was a woman trying to leave the parking lot, and there was a man very aggressively blocking her car, yelling obscenities, pounding on the car. And I had this moment of, this actually is bystander in real life, bystander situation. And I was thinking about later how in that moment I had a million thoughts going through my head. And this is literally what I think about day and night. And I teach about it and I study it. And I still felt unsure what to do in that particular situation. And so I won't ask people to share in this moment, but just sort of thinking for you, like if you were in the situation or some of the situations you've been in, like what would you do in that situation? And how do you come to that decision, right? So for me, it was I felt like I had to do something. I was very concerned about the severity. It seemed extremely physically violent and verbally violent, and it seemed like it was escalating. I thought about what would happen if I went over there, and I did consider that, but I also did feel pretty unsafe in the moment. And so I ended up going back into the hospital and finding a security guard to come out and diffuse the situation. But the reason I bring this up and share this with you is just that, it really is this complex process of decision making that goes on, and it's not this clear cut, like this is what we automatically do. And I think we recognize that. So going back to this model that Latine and Darley put forth, they helped us understand it is this complex decisional process. It's not usually just this automatic response to take action. And I'm going to just briefly go through what those steps are, which, the first is just even being able to notice the event. And I saw something recently about some signs that they have in, I think it's in Paris, but it's somewhere in France where it's on the curb, that tells people to look up, because now, even right with all the devices we have and our headphones in and everything, we're not even always aware of what's going on in the physical environment around us. So having those cues to even pay attention, like look up, look around and see what's going on, is an important part of then leading to the decision, right, as to whether or not we're going to take action. The next is interpreting the situation as one where we need to actually intervene. And this is where things like ambiguity come in. I'm not sure what's going on. That both people were drinking. I'm not sure if I should be stepping into that situation. Or this is where people's own personal beliefs or myths could come up, like, well, that person did that and they made their own bed and it's not my role to be stepping in, which also sort of comes with number 3, which is feeling that it's your role to actually take responsibility. And when I come to some of the studies that I'm going to share with you in a little bit, we see that there are barriers at all of these different steps, but sometimes people really do not feel that it's their role or necessary to take responsibility in a situation. And even if you do feel like it's your responsibility, sometimes people don't know what to do. So in that situation I shared, I felt like it was my responsibility to do something. And I had a moment, though, of saying, I don't actually know exactly what to do in here. And then it's actually going through um, and following through with what we said we were going to do, and taking the action and implementing it and worrying about how people might react to that, and several barriers that can occur at that stage as well. So clearly, the point being, it's not as easy as just saying we're going to do something and step in. And as a result of that, and really our understanding of that, several bystander intervention education programs were developed, and they're developed to really help people develop the skills to move through these steps. We know they're not always linear. There are more complex models out there now, including one that Vicki Banyard has put out there that talks about how much context is important and the particular dynamics of the situation. So we know that there's just a lot that we need to try to address if we want to encourage people to take action. And I think one of the questions I'm reaching, or I guess wrestling with a little, is do we ultimately want to be encouraging everyone to take action in all situations or not? And so the good news that we found from these programs is that generally the research has been very positive, in terms of the outcomes. So there's a pretty strong body of evaluation research. And for those of you who are social scientists, this is considered rigorous. There are randomized control trials that have been showing fairly successful outcomes and changing a lot of pro-social outcomes. So things like people's intentions to intervene in hypothetical situations, their efficacy, feeling like, yes, I feel like I could intervene in this situation, that programs are very effective at helping that, increasing the sense of responsibility, and actually increasing behaviors. And Ann Coker and her team have done some really wonderful work in looking not only at colleges but at high schools, and have found that actually in schools where there are bystander intervention programs, that both perpetration and victimization have gone down. So again, there are some really, really promising results, and most of this work has been done in colleges and some with high schools as well. However, there's research showing that, these effects do tend to wane over time. So that's certainly a concern. And then I think the question again that I keep coming up to, and that I know others are wrestling with right now, like, and does it work for everybody? And sort of what other factors are out there that are impacting people's that decisional model that I shared? And specifically, like, what are the risks and the vulnerabilities that we need to be thinking about as we present these programs, and as we think about how to engage people in creating these communities that they want on campus and beyond? And so, in this way, research is increasingly looking at different levels of a social ecology to really understand how these different levels beyond just the individual impact bystander intervention, and whether it is indeed the best strategy for us to use going forward. So on the next slide, I have the socio-ecological model with a lot of stuff. It's a kind of busy slide, so I'm not expecting everyone to see everything on here. But I just sort of wanted to give a snippet of what we've been learning about what factors impact bystander intervention, and that these occur at these multiple levels. And really, the research has mostly focused on the individual level, like the person's awareness, their empathy, their sense of responsibility, certain demographics. And there's been a little bit more research also looking at the relationship level. So, sort of, what are the norms or perceived norms of peers? What kinds of influence do people have on that individual in terms of their expectations of how they behave? But we're learning that even beyond that, and as for my social workers out there, this is the whole person and environment, right, kind of framework, that there are different levels of influence. So, at the community or organizational level, which is something I'm really interested in, I'm going to present some of that research to you today. Like, what are leaders communicating? What are the organizational norms, policies, expectations? What are the expectations that people step in or that they don't? And at the societal level, like, how does power, how do people's identities, and how do these systematic structures affect people's feelings of power in these situations, and also influence and predict what outcomes might happen for somebody based on who they are and based on these social structures? So I'm going to come back to all of that. What I'd like to do now is shift a little bit to share the results of several studies we've conducted over the last few years, to really try to dig into some of these questions a bit more, and understanding different experiences of bystander intervention, and specifically how those issues of identity, power, risk that are based on these social structures come into play. And the ones I'm presenting today are related to the topic of sexual violence, given the focus of this talk. But I just wanted to note we also are expanding our work, as are other researchers across the country, to look at how bystander intervention models might apply to other topics. My friend Annalise Meineke is looking down at University of North Carolina, Charlotte, looking a lot at alcohol use and how bystander intervention might be useful there. Vicki Banyard and her colleagues are doing a lot in looking at self-directed violence. We're engaged in a study looking at gun violence as well. And so I think, as I'm presenting this to you today, that while again I'm focused on sexual violence, that I think some of these questions and considerations apply to looking at bystander intervention in other settings, which is interesting to think about. And I'd love to hear from any of you doing that work as well. So the first few examples are from work we did with students on college campuses, which is where bystander approaches are quite common at this point. And so we'll start with that. So as I mentioned, the bulk of work on bystander intervention evaluation has been done with college students and found those positive results. However, several years ago, at our own campus and from some other campuses where I'm involved, we heard from practitioners when we were developing toolkits and talking about bystander intervention that not all students really felt engaged in the same way in bystander intervention. And so we put forth a study and we used concept mapping methodology, which was new to me as a methodology, but one that I'd really encourage you to check out if you're not familiar with it. And we did this concept mapping, which combines sort of qualitative and quantitative methods with 101 students. And they helped us, they co created this. And they talked about identifying as being a person of color. That was the terminology that was used, or LGBTQAI plus, or having an intersection of both. And so we asked students who identified in those ways about their perspectives about what types of situations they observed that warranted bystander intervention, what factors served as barriers or facilitators to intervening, and what made them feel welcome or what could be improved in sort of the programming aspects of this. And so the results were mixed. The overall feeling from participants was that bystander intervention actually was a really good approach, and they liked the idea of generally that this should be a responsibility for everybody and not just particular individuals. One of the things that has come up that I've been thinking about quite a lot too, it came up in this study and some others, is that we use this idea of like campus community or communities quite a lot in bystander intervention, saying like it's a community issue and it's one where all members of the community have, a role to play. And some people have expressed concern with the fact, what do we mean by community? I don't feel part of the community. And so I think we need to think carefully about what that means. And some of the other just sort of large findings there, and I have the paper citation there if anyone wants to read more, was the takeaway was that work like sexual violence prevention is not and cannot be really siloed right from people's other experiences of other forms of harm or what their identity is outside of being a survivor or affected by sexual violence, and that the climate related to issues like racism, to sexism, to homophobia, that they are all intertwined with how we approach these efforts. And so generally, students felt that if a program was just very exclusively focused on sexual violence without acknowledging these other forms of harm, that it felt like it had somewhat of an empty ring to them. And students also talked about how would I be feeling comfortable stepping in if I'm in a climate or an institution where I don't feel safe or respected based on whatever combination of identities I may have. And I wanted to just share a little bit more about some of the things that they said. So one of the student participants said in one of their classes, they were the only student who was representing that marginalized identity. And the student said that a professor was making a derogatory comment to another student, and she said, I didn't feel the need or ability to say anything because I was the only African American female in the class. I probably would have felt comfortable going to speak with her if I had somebody else that could kind of sympathize with the situation. And we had other students talk about that too, that they felt that there are, because of racism and because of people's stereotypes, that they didn't want to step in and say anything because they felt that they would be judged in ways that were different than dominant identities. They also talked about what works. And so someone else said, I've been in classes where the professor said something that was way out of line, and I would speak up. And then people in my class would also back me up as well. I feel like in certain classes, we've had a sense of community where we kind of understood where we all were coming from. And if something was wrong, we spoke up. I feel like just having those people behind you to defend you was nice. So this sense of community, right, and it being something that we do collectively was important to students in this study, who didn't want to feel the burden was on them alone. And we have published something recently where we talk about this idea of bystander burden, and that we sometimes, just like with issues of racism, expect the people who are affected to be the ones who are speaking up, and that's exhausting and cumulatively presents stress and unfair burden to them. So how can we get people who maybe aren't affected in the same way to speak up, or people who have access to resources or power to speak up more? Students also said the reality of power is, an issue, especially in academic settings. And that's something I'm going to go into with the next study as well. But this quote was, a lot of times people don't speak up against a professor because they're scared of failing the class and being removed from the class. In my class, that's what happened. And I just dropped the class. I just left. So clearly witnessing these situations, right, also, and seeing nobody take action, also has a really negative impact on students as well. And while we're on the issue of power, and thinking about academia, I wanted to share a study that we did with two medical schools, with students in medical schools. And we asked them about experiences of sexual violence, including harassment, that people experienced. And then we asked if bystanders were present, and they were present for the majority of incidents, over 62%. And when bystanders were present, it was also typically witnessed by more than one person. However, um, in most of the cases, people did not intervene when this occurred. And the focus groups that we did with medical students, which I'm sure doesn't come to surprise to folks, was there was this very strong feeling of norms, right, around challenging those with power in medical school. And that people were very concerned about retaliation. And so, the literature shows that college students in general may have concerns about challenging professors and those in power, that medical students and trainees have like very specific vulnerabilities as well. But I think these are true for other students, especially graduate students, because, right, their instructors are influencing their career trajectories through evaluations, letters of recommendations, introductions to their networks. And so people felt very concerned about moving forward with, speaking up in these situations. Um, and then I wanted to also share, I'm just keeping my eye on the time. I wanted to share a few examples about that we also found within college, university, faculty, and staff. So we know sexual violence impacts, not only students, but there's been a lot less research on faculty and staff, even though we know that they are experiencing this, and that academia is a workplace, and that sexual violence in its many forms occurs here as well. And so we know that it actually is a quite common experience, especially sexual harassment. And there's growing literature and actually some programs in place at several institutions that are bystander intervention programs designed for faculty and staff around issues of sexual harassment. So I wanted to share some findings from some of our studies. We did one study where we looked at faculty and staff experiences related to sexual harassment across 3 campuses. And we asked about a few different time periods, one of them being, did you experience sexual harassment in the past 12 months? Where we found that just under 11% experienced at least one type of sexual harassment in the past year. And we asked if people did anything, did anyone witness? And the response there was that in the majority of incidents, actually, people were present and did witness this. And then our next question in the survey was, did they do anything? And overwhelmingly, the answer was no, they did not. 78.6% said no. And what we found is that people were more likely to take action when the transgressor, the person committing the incident, did not have supervisory power over the target. So we found that to be statistically significant. So again, just thinking again about like what is realistic to ask people to do. If we're in situations where this is occurring and this power dynamic is there, it clearly is a factor we need to be considering when we're thinking about designing programs and moving this work forward. So when they did do anything, we then asked like, what happened then? Did it make it better? Did it make it worse? And we found actually no one, although it was a small number, no one said that it made it worse. About just under half said that it didn't do anything. There was no difference. But 53% said that it made it better. So it just shows sort of some of the complexity here in that, like, there is still this promise, right? And it does mean something to people when people speak up for them or intervene or offer support. And no one felt that it made the situation worse, which is often a concern that people have about stepping in. Like, I don't want to make the situation worse. And we have had some other studies, we did a study looking at domestic violence, and sometimes people actually do feel like when bystanders step in, they make the situation worse. But I think, this still does show some promise there. It also, one of my recommendations at the end is we need to be having research where we are talking to survivors quite a bit about what is helping them, what's actually helping them, what strategies. We did some qualitative work with faculty and staff as well, and just wanted to share a few quotes because of this idea of power that keeps coming out. And I think, again, if we're going to be introducing and designing programs, we really need to be thinking about how we're tackling this piece. So in this interview, this person was talking about bystander intervention and said, I have peers or colleagues with more positional power than I do. There are other people at my exact same rank that have more funding or more social networks or less funding and less social networks or more support from the university president. And they said they were feeling like that was going to come into play for whether or not they were actually going to step in and say something. Um, Another person said faculty, and I can say this as a faculty member too, can create their own fiefdoms and think they can set their own rules by how groups run. And so if I'm aware of something going on in somebody else's group, even in my department, I may not choose to make a stink about it or report it, so to speak, to the chair or to the dean, because I don't want to make myself look like I'm a troublemaker or a whistleblower. So again, how do we address that when we're creating these programs? And that's what I'll be getting to towards the end of the presentation. And again, just thinking about where people are coming from, their own backgrounds, things like socioeconomic factors for folks. This person talked about growing up poor and that class is a big part of identity. In academia, there's unique language and way of being. And harassers often thrive by understanding the language and lingo of academia. And if you grow up in a different class situation, you're not going to know that lingo or understand that structure of how you get through that system. So it puts you at a vulnerability and a disadvantage. And someone else was very direct and said, if I wasn't dependent on this job, I would say a lot more than I have. As a single mom, I'm not going to do anything that makes me lose my job. And I don't know that we've adequately considered that, right? When we're talking about bystander intervention and that idea of like, if you see something, say something, that it's obviously, it's just a lot more complex than that. And there are these differential sort of risks and vulnerabilities and access to power that people have that are coming into their decision making. The last set of research that I want to share is about some work that we've been doing looking at bystander intervention in the workplace, where just taking it out of the college context and out of the educational context, we've been trying to understand a little bit more about what's happening in workplaces. There also are increasing calls there to have bystander intervention programs. And so we did a study with just under 1,000 employees from around the country and asked about them witnessing several different types of mistreatment, including sexual harassment. And this is the subsample of 955 that said they had seen at least one type of mistreatment over the last year. And we asked them, did you think you could intervene? And here, like the numbers are a little bit lower than usually what we see with students, with the majority of them actually feeling no, like I didn't feel like I could intervene. And so then we dug into that a little bit more. Um, we asked those who felt they could intervene if they actually did. And of those, the majority did, just under 80%. But there was a group of those who didn't end up intervening, and sort of um, between the groups of those who said they didn't feel they could intervene, and then those who didn't intervene, even if they wanted to, we tried to look a little bit at what some of the barriers were. And again, coming back to this theme of power, we looked at the situations where people said that they intervened or not. When the bystander had supervisory power over the transgressor, the person who was committing the act, they were more likely to intervene. When the transgressor had supervisory power over the victim, they were less likely to intervene, which really isn't surprising, but there hasn't been a lot of research really demonstrating that. And I think, again, as we're designing these programs or thinking about organizational accountability or what kind of training we do for leaders and managers, thinking about these different factors is really important. And these were, we did a qualitative analysis as well with looking at what some of the barriers were that folks expressed. Um, and going back to sort of looking at Latine and Darley's steps, the situation wasn't intervention worthy, meaning if the incident had been sexual or violent in nature, I would have not hesitated to report it. They were talking here about an incident where it was sexual harassment, but they didn't see it as something where they needed to intervene. A lot of people talked about how it wasn't their responsibility. This is something for human resources, or they weren't in my department. People talked about not wanting to become involved. I stay out of other people's business unless asked by a higher authority. So the power piece comes in here. There are people who said, I just put my head down and do my work when I'm at work. I don't want to get involved in drama. Other people did feel responsible, but felt like they weren't sure what to do. New to the company, didn't know what to do or say. People said they weren't aware of where they would even go to report or what systems. And those are right, like those are some modifiable factors that we can be thinking about. And power dynamics was huge. I could do a whole presentation just on these barriers that we found in this one study related to power dynamics. But people talked about how, the transgressor was their manager, and I dare not speak against him. And that was the language that this person used. So clearly, there's a very strong norm in that particular organization where you don't speak up against your boss. And for sake of time, I won't go through all of these. You can see some of them here, but these were some other quotes that came out specifically about like power and organizational norms, about feeling that they weren't either in a position of authority to be able to do something and that this was really a supervisor's role, or perhaps like people had acted like this before and people had stepped in and it hadn't made a difference. Um, and people feeling really like they didn't wouldn't be able to make a difference even if they spoke up, that they weren't valued in their agency. And the last one here I put because the reality is for many people they were very worried about losing their jobs. And that is just something that we haven't, I don't think, really done a great job of understanding, again, this idea of risk and vulnerability when we're asking people to step up. So with the last few minutes of my presentation, I sort of wanted to leave with like, so what do we do with all of this, right? This complicated sort of nuanced back and forth about whether bystander intervention is helpful, whether it's not, what we need to do to sort of improve it. And so a group of us actually did try to do a review of work out there looking at having approaches to bystander intervention that are ecological. So not just looking at the individual, but looking at those other factors that we talked about, and that are social justice based. So they're really rooted in these principles of understanding how structures are coming into play as well. And so these are the things that I'll share, and they're in our commentary, which is in press right now. But obviously, that when we talk about strategies, we do that a lot in bystander intervention. Like we have people practice strategies, or we say, you can call the police, you can do this, you can do that. That we need to be inclusive and really think about what the risk means. Calling the police for some people is not seen as a positive strategy. It's seen as one that could produce more harm. And so, thinking about the strategies we present and the implications and how not everybody has the same experience is important. Um, the other thing, and I've had some interesting conversations here, is like bystanders often think that they're being really helpful, but they're not always. And sometimes we rush so much into like doing something and here's what you can do without also giving people time to think about their own biases. Like if you have racist or homophobic beliefs and you're doing your version of helping, that's complicated and problematic, right? So, like, are there ways we can also build in some of the education to make sure that it's including this ability to self reflect on what our own biases are and where we might be contributing to some of these issues, either in like small microcosms or larger structural forms? Um, Black feminist thought talks a lot about incorporating storytelling and real life scenarios, and those tend to be very powerful. Of course, doing those in ethical ways, in ways where people feel comfortable, but really trying to collect people's stories and have real life experiences that they can share seem to bring more meaning to understanding bystander intervention. Providing support to bystanders in the moment and also long term. I mean, one of my dreams for a next project is to look at this a little bit more in terms of whether we can be using technology or other ways to really be present for someone who's saying, like, when I was in that situation, I'm in this situation, what can I do? And for others as well, to make it more accessible, to make sure people know there's support, to have opportunities to process after somebody provides that support. We found that people's experiences with bystander intervention influence their likelihood to do that in the future. And so, providing that support's important. Um, I, again, am a proponent of bystander intervention, but I'm just fully convinced at this point it has to be one piece of a larger prevention package, right? Like if you're just asking people to step in and your institution or your organization doesn't have somewhere to refer people to or has norms that discourage or allow retaliation, then it's not going to be effective. So it really needs to be a much more holistic approach that where bystander intervention is one piece and continuing to work for that larger change. And so these are some of the next steps that we're hoping to engage in with research in this area, really using co-design to understand people's lived experiences and realistic challenges with bystander intervention, as well as what's helped them. Um, the measurement around power and its influence when looking at bystander intervention isn't so well developed. There's some really great work, though, in looking at sort of organizational development. There's some really cool stuff there that we've been looking at. There's a lot on what the barriers are, but we also want to know what's working and what's successful. And we want to hear that from survivors and people who are targeted as well. Like, what actually helped you in that situation? Um, we want to, again, test like, is bystander intervention more effective when it's part of these larger prevention packages and looking at it over time? And as I said at the bottom here, really hearing from people who are affected. So with that, I want to close so that we have time for some questions and answers and any ideas or successes or challenges that you've come up with in this work. I have my contact information here with a little QR code that you can also scan to come find out more about our center. I know in these types of presentations, you don't always have your questions formulated yet, or you might be thinking about something later. And I'm more than happy to have you all follow up at another time and chat about things that have come up your way or learn about research or contributions that you're making as well. So please feel free to be in touch. And at this point, then I think I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back over to see if we have questions and some time for Q&A.
Mhm. Thank you so much. Wonderful talk. Yeah, I'd like to open it up for questions that anybody might have. And I see a hand. I see Lisa Eaton. You want to jump in?
Yeah. Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for a really phenomenal talk. I very much thoroughly enjoyed it. So I just very much appreciate your time and what you've shared with us today. My question for you is about, and you kind of touched upon this. I think it might be like an area of future research that you're planning on, but I'm wondering about um, how do we pair bystander interventions with other forms of intervention that might kind of like target different how sexual violence manifests itself in various different ways. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the types of on how sexual or sorry, on how bystander interventions could be paired with other interventions, or what types of interventions they could potentially be paired with. Just I'm just curious kind of like where you might think about taking that research.
Thank you for that question. And I think it's such an important one. And yes, I have my like grant applications where, semi prepped, where we would be trying to look at how sort of I wonder about questions like cumulatively and over time, what people have been exposed to in terms of prevention. To me, I think the more exposures we have over time are really important. I was on a commission that looked at sexual violence, and we talked about like, well, when should education really begin on, trying to address sexual violence? And everyone was sort of like, from the womb, like as soon as you're out, right? It's not called sexual violence prevention education when kids are in kindergarten, but the pieces related to bullying or being respectful or kind to somebody or understanding their boundaries with consent, all of those things are actually continual education. And so, one of the things I'd love to be able to look at is if people are exposed to these different types of education over time, do they build upon one another? And does that put people in a better place when they're maybe in high school or college to be receptive to messages about sexual violence intervention techniques like bystander intervention? So that's one of the questions, is sort of developmentally and level of exposure, right? Like prevention science tells us you have to have multiple doses over time to really understand messages. Another thing that I think still we are grappling with is this idea of like understanding the issues themselves. So there's been some work that shows that people who have a higher belief in things like rape myths or sort of these prejudicial beliefs about an issue like sexual violence are also less likely to intervene, or they're intervening in ways that actually can sort of um, make the problem even worse. Like we found that people with higher rape myths felt that, yes, of course, I would intervene if a stranger was attacking somebody, but they didn't even sort of see the problems that could occur within a relationship, for example. So, and I have a colleague doing some work on this in looking at its application to racism. Like, how much do we need to go in depth to make sure people, first of all, even understand the issues? But I think that does have to go hand in hand with bystander intervention to some extent. I wish there was a way we could sort of figure out and differentiate where people are in their knowledge levels, and then we could have like, that sort of tailored for them as well. And then I think there are a lot of like policy type related interventions that need to be part of our efforts as well. That if there's a retaliation policy at your university, you might feel more comfortable coming forward, being able to speak up when something happens. So I have more thoughts. I'll leave it at that for now, but happy to chat.
I want to sort of follow up on that. I guess I'll take the prerogative of being the host. Um, One of the things that you did not mention, I don't believe, is the internet and the level of misogyny and online, and that, for many, especially young women, and LGBTQ people, um, that's a place where people experience a lot of harm. And I mean, my graduate gender class, literally later this afternoon, we're talking about the book Man Up by Cynthia Idris Miller. And um, and I think that increasingly, my understanding is that for young people, they're just like, yeah, that's the price you pay for being online. And, so I think the problem goes beyond, just witnessing something, with, in real time. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that. And we also know all the kinds of harms like choking among college students that are just, spread online.
Absolutely. And thank you for bringing that up. And some of our studies did ask whether the incidents occurred in person or online. The ones we did in the workplace, for example, and about 80% of them were in person that they reported witnessing. Now that's a different age group, so I think that is one of the pieces that you were speaking to, how normative it is at this point to see all of this and experience it online. And also, we didn't know, do people not recognize it the same way online because maybe it is normalized? So when you talk about, accompanying interventions and just sort of awareness more generally, like understanding the specifics of what this looks like online is definitely important. And even understanding some of the norms for college students around, partners who might feel that it's okay to check your social media sites or track you, or all those kinds of behaviors that are problematic but are being somewhat normalized now. How do we educate people about what those risk behaviors are, and also what can you do about that? Where can you bring that? And I do think there are bystander intervention education programs that have been incorporating that into their curriculum, and it sort of has to be relevant at this point, right? Um, so I don't know that that fully answers your question. I have a doctoral student who's looking at manosphere and sort of some of the messaging that's out there as well, which, like, when we talk about large structural issues, that we need to be addressing at the same time. That would fall into that bucket for me as well. And I have a lot more thoughts on that, but I know we're limited on time.
Yeah, I have follow-up, but I think I'll share the space a little bit. I see John has a hand up.
Thank you. Hi, Sarah. Thank you very much. Very thought-provoking. My head is on fire with many questions. I'm going to try and articulate it as I speak. But as you were talking, this community effort, and it requires skill building, I was thinking of culture. And I wanted to know, what your thoughts on how important does culture play a role? And I'm thinking about individualistic cultures or collectivist cultures where there's always this thought of the greater good of people. Does that make bystanders, take action? The first research that you showed, identity played a big role in people helping others based on sexuality, I think, is what I gathered from there. Then your work in OD, organizations have cultures that, individuals come from different cultures, they come into an organization. So if the culture is a culture that supports reporting, I'm hoping, bystander intervention will be high then. So I was just curious on your thoughts and if there's research on that.
That is a great question, John. Thank you for raising that. And I was trying to see if Christy Anthony, I saw she was on before. I don't know if she's still on, but I had the privilege of being on her dissertation committee, and she was actually looking at this issue. So very much, encourage you to connect with her. But yes, and John, you and I should talk. There are so many different definitions of culture, right? As you alluded to, whether it's an organizational culture, whether it's a community culture, whether it's related to somebody's identity in a specific ethnic or racial group. We did a project a few years ago here in New Brunswick with men who were immigrants, largely from Mexico. And it was called 100+ Men, and it was about trying to engage men in this work and having them speak up about violence. And we had some really interesting conversations, like the stuff that we had used on college campuses was not going to fly in those situations. That's not how they interacted. That was not the norms that they had. You didn't challenge one another in the same way that we talked about, like with our football players, about trying to challenge one another when you see certain behavior. So that's where I do think the co-design is just so important, and having input from people with whom we're trying to develop programs, which seems so obvious, but we don't do that so many times. We take what we think is going to work and sort of, try to impose it on a particular group, and it's not working. So I think all of those things you mentioned, like if it is collective, I'm working with a student right now who's doing some work in Ghana where like he does not feel that this would be well accepted. And so he's doing some work to find out like what would be. Are there other ways that those conversations could happen? Or could it be like involving a religious leader or something like that? So yes, I think things really need to be tailored to the specific people, and that they need to be part of, designing it. I think some of the principles, and I can't say this without like further research, but I think one of the things we're trying to understand, are there these tenets of bystander intervention that might apply no matter what, but then need to be tweaked and tailored to really be effective? So short answers to some of these really deep, thoughtful questions, which I very much appreciate.
Thank you.
And thank you so much. I just want to thank you one more time on behalf of InCHIP and all of us. But we are a little bit past time. So again, thank you for a really informative talk and for all the great work that you are doing. And thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you all. Feel free to reach out, and I very much appreciate the invitation and the time you all made to be here. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.